when a liberal professor decided to publicly humiliate a student. She had no idea that she was challenging a genius with an IQ of 170 to a duel. Barron Trump watched in silence until she drove herself into a trap. But the main twist is still ahead. Watch to the end, because this story will make you reconsider everything you know about modern education. In one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, Professor Evelyn Carter was well known for two things: her brilliance in mathematics and her strong ideological stance on social issues. Over the years, her lectures had slowly shifted from pure mathematical instruction to incorporating discussions on privilege, equity, and systemic biases within academia. Some students appreciated these insights, while others felt they detracted from the rigorous coursework they had signed up for. That morning, as students filled the lecture hall, a subtle tension lingered in the air. The usual complex equations that typically adorned the whiteboard were absent. Instead, a bold statement stretched across the board: mathematics and social justice, a new perspective. Sitting near the back of the lecture hall, a tall, quiet young man adjusted his cufflinks and observed the unfolding scene. Few students knew him personally, but everyone recognized his name: Barron Trump. Despite his reserved nature, his reputation as an academic prodigy had spread through the university. However, what most didn't know was the sheer extent of his intellectual capabilities. Professor Carter entered the room, her stride confident as she placed her notes on the podium. "Good morning, class," she began. "Today, we'll be discussing the importance of integrating contemporary social issues into our academic framework. Mathematics does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the society that utilizes it." Some students nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The lecture took a sharp turn from advanced calculus to a discussion on how privilege influences academic success. Barron sat still, listening carefully, his expression unreadable. His right hand slowly rose. Professor Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as she noticed him. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Trump?" Her tone carried an edge of expectation, as if she were already prepared to dismiss whatever argument he was about to present. Barron's voice was calm, respectful. "Professor Carter, wouldn't reducing the focus on core mathematical principles in favor of social discussions disadvantage all students, regardless of background?" A hush fell over the room. Professor Carter's lips pursed. "Mr. Trump, perhaps you, of all people, should understand that not everyone has had the advantages that come with wealth and influence. Some students need a different approach to succeed in a system that historically favors certain demographics." A few students nodded, while others exchanged wary glances. Barron, however, remained unshaken. "I completely agree that education should be accessible to all," he said smoothly. "But does that mean we should lower the rigor of our studies instead of elevating students to meet the challenge?" The professor's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting that traditional academic standards should remain untouched, even at the cost of inclusivity?" Barron tilted his head slightly. "I'm suggesting that knowledge itself is the great equalizer. Mathematics doesn't discriminate. Numbers remain objective, no matter who is solving them." A few students murmured in agreement. Professor Carter, however, wasn't ready to concede. With a smirk, she turned to the board and in bold strokes wrote out a monstrous equation, one so intricate that even the most advanced students in the room felt their stomachs sink. "If mathematics is such a universal truth," she said, stepping back with satisfaction, "then please, Mr. Trump, show us how it's done." The challenge hung heavy in the air. The equation sprawled across the board was a daunting integration problem that required a mastery of advanced mathematical concepts that had not yet been covered in class. A student whispered, "That's graduate-level material." Professor Carter crossed her arms. "Or perhaps you'd rather discuss privilege instead?" Barron exhaled slowly, then rose from his seat. Without a word, he strode toward the board, his presence commanding yet effortless. He took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine interest rather than apprehension. After a moment, he turned to the class. "There are multiple ways to approach this," he began, his tone measured. "Would you like me to use the conventional method, or would you prefer to see a more efficient approach?" Professor Carter's smirk flickered slightly. You claim to know efficient approach? Barron nodded. Yes. It's a method I came across while studying some lesser-known work from 18th-century mathematical journals. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Professor Carter's posture stiffened. Then by all means, Mr. Trump, proceed. And so he did. With precision and clarity, Barron began working through the equation, explaining each step in a way that made even the most complex concepts accessible. His voice was steady, his reasoning impeccable. As the calculations unfolded, students who had initially struggled to follow Professor Carter's lectures found themselves nodding along, understanding the logic behind his methodology. By the time he reached the final solution, the room was completely silent. He capped the marker and turned to Professor Carter. And that, he said, is the answer. The professor's face was unreadable, but the tension in her stance betrayed her frustration. She had expected him to falter, to stumble under the pressure. Instead, he had just delivered a masterclass in problem-solving. Before she could respond, a hand shot up from the middle of the room. Could you explain that second method again? A student asked hesitantly. It actually made more sense than the way we've been doing it. Barron nodded. Of course. He turned back to the board and began breaking it down step by step, patiently guiding the class through the solution. Professor Carter's grip on her notes tightened. This was no longer a challenge. It had become a lesson, one where she was no longer in control. Just then, the door to the lecture hall opened, and a familiar voice called out, Professor Carter, we need you for an urgent faculty meeting. Dean Mitchell stood at the threshold, his expression unreadable. The timing could not have been worse for Professor Carter, or better, depending on how she chose to handle it. We'll have to continue this another time, she said quickly, stepping away from the board, eager to escape. But Barron wasn't finished. Professor, you issued a challenge, he said, his voice steady. Walking away from it now would send an unfortunate message about academic integrity. A murmur of agreement rippled through the class. The dean hesitated. Is there a problem here? Barron turned to him with a polite but firm expression. No problem, sir. Just a lesson in consistency. The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Carter looked between Barron, the equation, and the expectant faces of her students. She had built her reputation on challenging the system, but today she had been challenged in return, and the entire class was watching to see what she would do next. The story was just beginning. Barron Trump sat back down in his seat, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with unspoken thoughts. Professor Evelyn Carter clenched the edges of her notes, her jaw tight. She had underestimated him, and now the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon her. Dean Mitchell, still standing at the doorway, cleared his throat. Professor Carter, if you need to leave for the faculty meeting, we can reschedule. No, she cut in sharply, before realizing how abrupt she sounded. She softened her tone, forcing a tight smile. This discussion is important. I'd like to see it through. Some of the students exchanged glances. They could see the internal battle playing out on their professor's face. This wasn't just about mathematics anymore. This was about control. Carter turned her attention back to Barron. Very well, Mr. Trump. You've proven that you can solve an advanced mathematical problem. But the question remains, why does it matter? Barron's eyebrow arched slightly. Why does math matter? I mean, she continued, her voice regaining some of its usual authority, in the real world, equations don't solve economic disparity. Calculus doesn't dismantle systemic oppression. The numbers you just wrote on the board, what do they actually do for the people who are struggling? Some students nodded in agreement, while others seemed uncertain. Barron, however, was unfazed. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. Professor, with all due respect, mathematics isn't about fixing social issues directly. It's about understanding the universe at a fundamental level. The same mathematical principles that allow us to predict planetary motion also power the algorithms that drive social media, control financial markets, and even help solve medical crises. Professor Carter smirked. You mean the same financial markets that have historically favored the wealthy? The same social media algorithms that perpetuate misinformation? Barron tilted his head. Blaming mathematics for how people use it is like blaming a hammer for being used as a weapon instead of a tool. A quiet murmur spread through the classroom. Carter's lips pressed together, but before she could respond, another voice broke the tension. "I'd like to hear more about that." The voice belonged to Rachel Lynn, a second-year engineering student who had spent most of the semester sitting in the middle of the classroom, rarely speaking. She leaned forward now, eyes sharp with curiosity. "What do you mean when you say mathematics powers these things?" Barron nodded, taking a deep breath. "Consider this. Social justice initiatives rely on data analysis to identify disparities and propose solutions. Algorithms detect biases in hiring processes. Even climate change models use complex calculus to predict and mitigate future environmental catastrophes. If we don't understand math, we lose our ability to engage in these discussions effectively." Rachel's expression shifted to contemplation, and a few other students murmured in agreement. Even those who had initially dismissed Barron's argument seemed to be considering his words. Professor Carter, however, was not ready to concede. She paced in front of the class. "That's a fair point, Mr. Trump. But let's not pretend that access to mathematical knowledge is equal. Not everyone has the luxury of private tutors and prestigious prep schools." Barron's eyes darkened slightly. "And you assume that lowering standards will fix that?" Carter hesitated. He had put her in a corner. Admit that rigorous education was necessary for all, or double down on the idea that it should be adjusted based on societal inequalities. She wasn't ready to admit defeat. Dean Mitchell, sensing the tension, stepped further into the room. "Perhaps what we should be asking is how we can bridge the gap without compromising academic integrity." The discussion shifted as students started to weigh in. Some sided with Barron, agreeing that knowledge should remain objective. Others felt that the education system itself needed reform to ensure equal opportunities. But something remarkable had happened. Rather than blindly accepting the professor's authority, the students had begun thinking critically for themselves. Barron sat back, watching the conversation unfold. He had made his point. Now it was up to the rest of the class to decide what they would take from it. Professor Carter exhaled, glancing at Barron. She still wasn't convinced, but for the first time, she realized that perhaps she wasn't the only one with something to teach. And in that moment, the balance of power in the classroom had shifted. The next morning, the atmosphere in the lecture hall was unlike anything the students had experienced before. The usual hushed murmurs before class were now replaced by lively discussions about the previous day's debate. Some students scrolled through social media posts detailing the interaction between Professor Evelyn Carter and Barron Trump, while others shared their thoughts in small groups, speculating about what would happen next. Barron, as usual, took his seat at the back of the room, his expression neutral. Despite the heated discourse from the day before, he appeared calm, as if the confrontation had been nothing more than an intellectual exercise. Professor Carter, on the other hand, walked in with a different demeanor. There was something calculated in the way she moved, composed but not unaffected. She had spent the night reflecting on what had transpired and, more importantly, on how to regain control of her class. She cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Before we begin today's lecture, I want to address something. Yesterday, we had a spirited discussion about the role of mathematics in broader societal issues. While I stand by my points, I recognize the importance of academic rigor. That being said, today's lesson will be fully focused on applied calculus. I hope that will satisfy those of you who feel that our coursework should remain strictly mathematical." A few students exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle concession in her words. It wasn't an outright admission of defeat, but it was a shift in tone nonetheless. She turned to the board and began writing a complex system of differential equations, transitioning seamlessly into her lesson. But even as she spoke, there was an underlying tension in the room. Barron listened intently, his focus never wavering. At one point, Professor Carter posed a challenging question to the class, and an uneasy silence settled in as students hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Without missing a beat, Barron raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Barron stood up and walked toward the board. "If we approach it using Laplace transforms, we can simplify the equation significantly," he stated, picking up a marker. He then proceeded to break down the problem, his explanation clear and concise. As he wrote, murmurs of appreciation rippled through the classroom. By the time he finished, Even the students who had been skeptical of him the day before were nodding in understanding. Professor Carter studied the solution for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. That's an interesting approach, she admitted. Not the method I was expecting, but undeniably effective. Barron nodded and returned to his seat. And just like that, the dynamic of the class shifted yet again. What had begun as an ideological battle was now becoming something different, an environment where merit truly took precedence over politics. Over the next few weeks, something even more unexpected happened. Students who had previously felt disengaged from the class began participating more actively. Some sought out Barron for help outside of class, eager to understand concepts that had once seemed impossible. Others started asking deeper, more critical questions, challenging both their own assumptions and those of their professor. Professor Carter, despite herself, found that she was learning just as much as her students. While she had initially viewed Barron as an adversary, she was now beginning to see him as something else entirely, a catalyst for change. One afternoon, after class had ended and most students had left, she approached Barron as he packed up his things. "Mr. Trump, may I have a word?" He looked up, nodding. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You're a remarkable student, but you already know that. What I don't understand is why you stay so engaged in this class when you clearly could be learning at a much higher level elsewhere." Barron considered her question before responding. "Because I believe in the importance of discourse, and because I think everyone deserves the chance to engage with knowledge, no matter what their background or beliefs are." She studied him carefully. "You challenge me, Mr. Trump." He gave a small smile. "That's the point of education, isn't it?" For the first time since the semester had started, Professor Carter found herself at a loss for words. And for the first time, she realized that perhaps she had more to learn from her students than she had ever imagined. The following week, the atmosphere in Professor Evelyn Carter's classroom had completely transformed. The unspoken tension that had once gripped the students had faded, replaced by an eagerness that was almost palpable. Students were more engaged, discussions more dynamic. And at the center of it all was Barron Trump. Despite initial resistance from Professor Carter, his impact was undeniable. Students who once remained silent now actively participated, inspired by the intellectual battles that had reshaped the class. The course had, in many ways, evolved beyond what Professor Carter had originally intended. It was no longer just an advanced calculus class. It had become a battleground for ideas, a place where students felt emboldened to challenge authority, including their professor. But not everyone was pleased with this shift. News of the classroom debates had spread beyond the confines of the university. Articles appeared in online blogs, some praising the intellectual rigor of the discussions, others criticizing the administration for allowing a student to upstage a tenured professor. Social media was abuzz with polarized reactions. Some heralded Barron as a symbol of academic excellence prevailing over political bias, while others painted him as an entitled prodigy using his privilege to disrupt a structured curriculum. Professor Carter was no stranger to controversy. She had built her career on pushing boundaries, challenging systems she viewed as outdated. But this time, she found herself in an unfamiliar position, not as the disruptor, but as the one being disrupted. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing lecture materials, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Dean Mitchell stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to set her on edge. The last time he had visited her classroom, things had not gone in her favor. "Evelyn," he began, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." She set her pen down. "I assume this is about Mr. Trump." Dean Mitchell nodded. "The situation has escalated beyond the classroom. The board is receiving complaints. Some faculty members believe you've lost control of your course." Professor Carter exhaled sharply. "Lost control? My students are more engaged than ever. They're thinking critically, debating, challenging ideas. Isn't that what higher education is supposed to be about?" The dean folded his hands together. "There's a fine line between intellectual rigor and chaos, Evelyn. Some are concerned that your authority in the classroom has been undermined." She leaned back in her chair. "So, what are you suggesting? That I shut down discourse?" That I silence a student simply because he challenges me? Dean Mitchell hesitated before speaking. I'm suggesting you find a way to regain balance. You're one of the most respected professors in this institution, but this has become bigger than you anticipated. Professor Carter crossed her arms. I refuse to compromise academic integrity just to appease those who are uncomfortable with debate. The dean studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then I suggest you prepare yourself, because whether you like it or not, this situation is far from over. Meanwhile, Barron was beginning to feel the weight of his growing influence. He hadn't set out to become a symbol. He had only wanted to ensure that intellectual merit was prioritized over ideological narratives. But now, he found himself at the center of a campus-wide discussion that extended far beyond the walls of a single lecture hall. Students who once ignored him now sought him out for discussions after class. Some asked for help with coursework, others wanted his opinion on broader academic issues. But there were also those who resented him, who saw him as a disruption rather than an innovator. One afternoon, as he exited the library, he was approached by a group of students. Among them was Daniel Rhodes, a senior known for his outspoken political activism. Daniel had never directly confronted Barron before, but today, there was a different energy about him. "Trump," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "Got a minute?" Barron adjusted his backpack. "Sure." Daniel didn't waste time. "You've made quite a name for yourself. Some people think you're some kind of academic savior." Barron remained expressionless. "I'm not here to be a savior. I just want education to be about knowledge, not politics." Daniel scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You don't have to fight for a seat at the table. You were born at the head of it." Barron met his gaze evenly. "So instead of focusing on making sure everyone can learn at the highest level, you'd rather tear down those who excel?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't get it. Some of us don't have the privilege of debating these things like it's a game." Barron exhaled, his patience unwavering. "It's not a game, but dumbing down education doesn't level the playing field. It just ensures that no one wins." A tense silence followed. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he muttered, "We'll see how long this lasts," before walking away. As the days passed, the controversy only intensified. More students joined the discussions, some in support of Barron's stance, others vehemently opposed. Professor Carter found herself caught in the middle, trying to maintain control of her class while resisting the external pressures to conform to a single narrative. The breaking point came during a faculty meeting. The tension in the conference room was suffocating. Professors, department heads, and administrative figures filled the space, all there to address the growing unrest surrounding Carter's class. "This is unprecedented," one professor argued. "We cannot allow a single student to dictate the direction of a course." "Is he dictating, or is he simply exposing flaws in the system?" another countered. Dean Mitchell sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Evelyn, you have the floor." Professor Carter took a deep breath before speaking. "The problem isn't Barron Trump. The problem is that we are uncomfortable with being challenged. We claim to champion free thought, yet the moment a student disrupts our expectations, we treat it as a threat." Some of the faculty members shifted uncomfortably. "This is a university," she continued, "a place where ideas should be debated. If we start silencing students simply because they force us to defend our positions, then we are no better than the systems we claim to criticize." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Dean Mitchell nodded. "Then I hope you're prepared to defend your own position, Professor. Because this debate is far from over." The tension on campus had reached its peak. What started as a classroom debate had exploded into a full-blown ideological battle that had captured national attention. News outlets had begun covering the controversy, some portraying Barron Trump as a defender of academic excellence, while others framed him as a privileged disruptor attempting to dismantle progressive education. Students, faculty, and even outside activists had taken sides, and the university administration found itself at the center of a storm it had never anticipated. Despite the chaos, Barron remained composed. He continued attending lectures, engaging in discussions, and helping students with their coursework. He had never set out to become a symbol of intellectual resistance, but now that he felt a responsibility to see it through. Professor Evelyn Carter, on the other hand, found herself in a more precarious position than ever. The faculty meeting had made it clear that the administration was watching her every move, waiting to see how she would handle the growing unrest. She knew that whatever happened next would define not only her career, but also the university's reputation. The final confrontation took place during an open forum organized by the university. The administration had arranged the event to address the controversy, inviting students, faculty, and guest speakers to engage in a formal debate on academic freedom, privilege, and the role of politics in education. The event was held in the largest auditorium on campus, and it was filled beyond capacity. Cameras from major news networks lined the back of the hall, broadcasting the event to millions. Barron sat on one side of the stage, representing the argument that academic rigor should not be compromised for ideological agendas. Opposite him sat Daniel Rhodes, the student activist who had confronted him outside the library. Professor Carter sat between them as the moderator, tasked with maintaining order. The debate began with formal statements. Daniel passionately argued that the education system was designed to benefit those born into privilege, and that changes were necessary to ensure fairness. He accused Barron of failing to recognize his own advantages and claimed that his push for pure academia ignored the struggles of underprivileged students. When it was Barron's turn, he spoke calmly but firmly. "I don't deny that privilege exists. What I do deny is the idea that lowering standards is the solution. True equality isn't achieved by making things easier for some. It's achieved by making excellence accessible to all. The solution isn't to remove academic challenges, but to equip every student with the tools to overcome them." The audience was split. Some cheered in support, others jeered in disagreement. The tension in the room was palpable. Professor Carter allowed the debate to flow, ensuring that both sides had the chance to express their points. But as the discussion progressed, something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing as opposing forces, Barron and Daniel began to find common ground. Daniel leaned forward, his expression less combative. "So what do you suggest, then? If we don't change the system to account for inequality, how do we fix it?" Barron considered the question carefully before answering. "We fix it by making sure that every student, no matter their background, has access to the highest quality education. That means scholarships, mentorship programs, and investment in schools that need resources the most. But what we don't do is dilute education itself. The moment we decide that some people can't handle academic rigor, we've already failed them." A murmur spread through the audience. Even some of Daniel's supporters nodded thoughtfully. Professor Carter, who had remained neutral throughout the debate, finally spoke. "It seems to me that both of you want the same thing, an education system that is fair and effective. Perhaps the real debate isn't about whether we should uphold academic excellence, but how we ensure that it's truly available to everyone." For the first time since the controversy began, the division in the room seemed to soften. The conversation shifted from ideological warfare to genuine problem-solving. Ideas were exchanged, and solutions were proposed. The forum, which had begun as a battle, ended as a conversation about progress. The aftermath of the debate reshaped the university in ways no one had predicted. Rather than driving the campus further apart, the discussion led to tangible changes. The administration implemented new scholarship programs for underprivileged students while reinforcing a commitment to academic excellence. Professors were encouraged to engage in open discourse without fear of backlash, and students felt more empowered to challenge ideas constructively. As for Barron, he continued his studies with the same quiet dedication as before, no longer just a student, but a symbol of the power of knowledge and debate. Professor Carter, once his most vocal critic, became one of his most unexpected allies, recognizing that true education was not about winning arguments, but about expanding minds. And as the semester came to a close, one thing became clear. The pursuit of truth, no matter how controversial, was worth every challenge it brought. The university had changed. The conversation had changed. And most importantly, the students had changed.